The people who smile through humiliation are often the ones carrying the strongest stories. On a busy Saturday evening, the harbor lantern was filled with the familiar sounds of polished silverware, quiet conversations, and soft piano music drifting through hidden speakers. The restaurant sat near the center of downtown, just a few blocks from City Hall, and attracted everyone from business executives to visiting tourists. Most customers came for the food. Some came to be seen. Claire Morgan came to work. At 29 years old, Claire moved through the dining room with effortless grace. She balanced heavy trays without appearing rushed. She remembered names, favorite orders, and anniversaries. Regular customers often requested her section because she treated every person the same way, whether they ordered a simple salad or the most expensive item on the menu. Her smile was warm, genuine, calm. Yet beneath that smile was a quiet strength very few people ever noticed. Around her wrist rested an old silver watch that had belonged to her father. The leather strap showed signs of age. The metal carried tiny scratches gathered over many years. Claire wore it every shift, not because it was valuable, because it reminded her who she wanted to be. Patient, kind, steady. Across the restaurant, a table near the center suddenly became the focus of attention. A group of well-dressed women entered together, laughing loudly as they crossed the room. At their center walked Victoria Hayes. She was known throughout the city for her wealth, social connections, and constant need to be the most important person in every room she entered. Expensive jewelry reflected the restaurant lights. Designer handbags rested on her arm. Confidence followed her like perfume. The hostess welcomed the group and escorted them to one of the best tables in the restaurant. Several employees exchanged quiet glances. Victoria had visited before. Those visits were rarely easy. Claire noticed the arrival while delivering drinks to another table. She did not react. She simply continued working. A few minutes later, the manager approached her with an apologetic smile. "Claire, table 12 is yours tonight." Claire glanced toward Victoria's table. Then she nodded. Of course. No complaint. No hesitation. She picked up a menu and walked toward the group. "Good evening, ladies. Welcome to the Harbor Lantern." Her voice remained warm and professional. Victoria barely looked up. Instead, she continued speaking to her friends as if Claire were not standing there. Claire waited patiently. Eventually, Victoria accepted a menu with a dismissive wave of her hand. The interaction lasted only seconds, but something about it made nearby diners uncomfortable. Claire simply smiled and continued taking drink orders. She had encountered difficult customers before. Yet as she moved away from the table, Victoria watched her with an expression that suggested the evening was only beginning. Around them, conversations continued. Glasses clinked softly. The piano played on. And somewhere beyond the restaurant windows, the city lights shimmered beneath the fading colors of sunset. Claire carried her tray toward the kitchen, still smiling, as though she already understood something everyone else had yet to discover. Claire had learned long ago that patience often revealed more about people than confrontation ever could. As the evening continued, she moved between tables with the same calm professionalism she showed every guest. Orders arrived from the kitchen. Drinks were delivered. Families celebrated birthdays. Couples shared quiet conversations beneath the warm restaurant lights. Yet Table 12 seemed determined to create its own atmosphere. Victoria Hayes and her friends treated the restaurant less like a place to enjoy dinner and more like a stage. Their laughter carried across the room. Their conversations often paused whenever Claire approached, only to resume with exaggerated expressions and knowing smiles. The behavior was subtle enough to avoid direct criticism, obvious enough for everyone nearby to notice. Claire remained unfazed. She refilled water glasses, answered questions, recommended menu items. Each interaction was met with the same steady smile. Victoria seemed almost disappointed by that. She had expected irritation, embarrassment, perhaps even an argument. Instead, Claire gave her nothing to react to. At one point, Victoria waved her hand before Claire had even reached the table. "Excuse me," she said loudly. "This water has been sitting here for almost 5 minutes." Several guests glanced over. Claire calmly replaced the glass. "I apologize for the inconvenience, ma'am." Victoria exchanged amused looks with her friends. At least someone here understands customer service. A few of the women laughed. Claire simply nodded and continued working. Near the kitchen entrance, another server shook his head quietly. I do not know how you stay so calm. Claire glanced toward her father's watch. Most things are not worth carrying home with you. The server smiled. I wish I could do that. Claire returned the smile and picked up another tray. Throughout the next hour, Victoria continued searching for reasons to complain. The bread arrived too early. The appetizers arrived too late. The music was too loud, then too quiet. Nothing seemed satisfactory. Yet Claire responded to every criticism with courtesy. Never defensive, never sarcastic, never rushed. Her composure slowly became more noticeable than Victoria's behavior. Other customers observed the contrast. So did the staff. Even the restaurant manager began paying closer attention. By 7:30, sunset painted the city outside in shades of gold and amber. The windows reflected the dining room like mirrors. Claire delivered the group's main course and wished them an enjoyable meal. As she turned to leave, she heard one of Victoria's friends whisper something followed by quiet laughter. Claire did not react. She continued walking. The old silver watch caught a beam of evening light as she moved through the restaurant. There was something almost unshakable about her calmness. It was not weakness. It was discipline. A discipline built over years of choosing dignity over drama. Across the room, Victoria watched her disappear toward the kitchen. For reasons she could not fully explain, Claire's refusal to become upset seemed to bother her more than any argument could have. And as the evening moved forward, the tension around table 12 continued to grow, carrying everyone closer to a moment that would soon change the atmosphere of the entire restaurant. By 8 o'clock, nearly every table in the Harbor Lantern was occupied. The restaurant glowed with the comfortable energy of a successful Saturday night. Waiters moved quickly between tables. The kitchen worked at full speed. Outside, the last traces of sunset faded into the deep blue of evening. Inside, however, attention continued drifting back toward table 12. Victoria Hayes seemed determined to remain the center of attention. Every few minutes another complaint appeared. Sometimes it concerned the food, sometimes the service, sometimes nothing at all. Claire Morgan handled each situation with remarkable patience. She listened carefully, apologized when necessary, offered solutions, then continued serving the rest of the restaurant with the same calm professionalism. The contrast between the two women had become impossible to ignore. Victoria grew louder. Claire grew quieter. Victoria demanded attention. Claire focused on her work. Victoria seemed to need an audience. Claire seemed perfectly comfortable without one. At a nearby table, an elderly couple exchanged glances after overhearing another complaint. The husband shook his head gently. That young woman serving them deserves a medal. His wife smiled. Or a vacation. Across the room, Claire delivered desserts to another family celebrating a birthday. She laughed with the children, helped take photographs, then immediately returned to assisting other guests. Watching her work made it difficult to imagine anyone finding fault with her. Yet Victoria continued trying. Shortly afterward, Claire approached table 12 carrying a fresh pot of coffee. "May I refill your cup, ma'am?" she asked politely. Victoria looked up. "Actually, before you do that, can you explain something?" Claire remained attentive. "Of course." Victoria leaned back in her chair. Several of her friends immediately became interested. "Do you ever wonder if you could have done more with your life?" The question hung in the air. Nearby conversations slowed. Not completely, just enough. Claire remained still. Victoria continued before she could answer. "I mean, spending every weekend carrying trays for strangers cannot have been your childhood dream." One of her friends laughed softly. Another looked uncomfortable. Claire stood quietly holding the coffee pot. For a brief moment, the restaurant seemed unusually silent. The question itself was not really a question. Everyone understood that. Victoria was not seeking an answer. She was seeking a reaction. Embarrassment. Anger. Anything. Claire looked at her calmly. Then she smiled. The same warm smile she had worn all evening. "I hope you are enjoying your dinner, ma'am." Victoria blinked. Clearly that was not the response she expected. "That is not what I asked." Claire gently filled the coffee cup. "No, ma'am. It is not." Then she moved to the next guest. No argument. No defense. No explanation. The simplicity of the response somehow made the entire exchange feel heavier. Several nearby customers looked down at their tables. Others watched Claire walk away. The old silver watch caught the restaurant lights once again as she disappeared toward the kitchen. Victoria stared after her. Something about that quiet dignity seemed impossible to challenge. Yet instead of letting the moment go, she appeared even more determined. As the evening continued, few people realized they were approaching the exact moment when everything would change. Because somewhere beyond the restaurant walls, another guest was already on his way. And unlike everyone else in the room, he knew exactly who Claire Morgan was. The tension that had been building throughout the evening finally began to settle over the restaurant like a visible cloud. Even customers who knew nothing about Victoria Hayes could sense that something was wrong. There was an uncomfortable imbalance in the room. One person seemed determined to prove her importance. Another seemed determined not to lose her dignity. Claire Morgan continued working as if neither challenge nor criticism existed. She greeted new guests, cleared tables, delivered meals. Her calmness never appeared forced. It was simply who she was. That fact seemed to frustrate Victoria more with every passing minute. At 8:15, the group ordered dessert. Claire arrived carrying a tray of beautifully prepared plates decorated with fresh berries and delicate chocolate designs. The desserts looked almost too elegant to eat. Finally, Victoria said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "I was beginning to think dessert might arrive sometime next week." A few awkward laughs came from her friends. Others stared down at their menus. Claire carefully placed each plate in front of the guests. "Thank you for your patience, ladies." Victoria examined the dessert. "You know, that smile never changes." Claire looked at her politely. "Ma'am." Victoria leaned back. "The smile. It is impressive, actually. Do they teach that during waitress training?" The comment landed heavily. Several people at neighboring tables exchanged uncomfortable glances. One of Victoria's friends quietly shifted in her seat. Even she seemed embarrassed now. Claire remained composed. "I hope you enjoy the dessert." "There it is again," Victoria said with a laugh. "Always polite. Always smiling." Her voice grew slightly louder. "Tell me something. Do you ever get tired of pretending everything is wonderful?" The restaurant had become noticeably quieter. Not silent, just attentive. Claire stood still for a moment. The old silver watch rested beneath the cuff of her sleeve. Her fingers lightly touched the serving tray. Then she offered the same gentle smile. "Everyone deserves kindness, ma'am. Especially on difficult days." The answer surprised everyone, including Victoria. For a brief second, uncertainty crossed her face. Then pride quickly returned. "That sounds like something written on a greeting card." Claire nodded respectfully. "Maybe, but it is still true." She turned and walked away before Victoria could respond. This time no one laughed. The atmosphere had changed. Several customers watched Claire cross the dining room. Not because she had won an argument, because she had refused to participate in one. Near the front entrance, the restaurant manager quietly observed everything. He had seen countless disagreements over the years. Yet something about Claire's grace stood apart. Meanwhile, outside, a black city vehicle slowed near the curb. Headlights reflected across the restaurant windows. The driver stepped out first. A moment later, another man emerged and adjusted his jacket before approaching the entrance. Few people inside had noticed yet. Most attention remained focused on table 12. The front door opened. Cool evening air drifted inside. Several staff members immediately recognized the new arrival. Conversations began slowing once again. Heads turned toward the entrance. But what happened next would surprise everyone. Because the distinguished guest who had just entered was not looking for a private table. He was not looking for the owner. He was not looking for the manager. His eyes moved across the dining room, searching for one person only. And the moment he spotted Claire Morgan, his face broke into a genuine smile. The moment the door opened, the energy inside the Harbor Lantern shifted. Conversations softened. Several diners immediately recognized the man who had just entered. Others noticed the reaction and turned to look. Thomas Reed, the mayor of the city, stepped inside with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to public attention. Yet there was nothing theatrical about him. No entourage crowding around him. No dramatic entrance. Just a respected public servant arriving for what appeared to be an ordinary visit. The restaurant manager hurried forward. "Mr. Mayor, welcome." Thomas smiled politely and shook his hand. "Good evening." The manager gestured toward a reserved table near the windows. "Your usual table is ready." Thomas nodded but did not move toward it. Instead, his attention remained fixed on someone across the dining room. Claire Morgan was collecting empty glasses from another table when she noticed him. For the first time all evening, genuine surprise appeared in her expression. Not anxiety, not concern, just surprise. Thomas immediately began walking in her direction. Several employees exchanged confused looks. A few customers straightened in their chairs. Even Victoria Hayes paused mid-conversation. Nobody understood what was happening. Claire set the glasses carefully onto a nearby service cart. Before she could say anything, Thomas reached her and extended his hand. His smile widened. "Claire Morgan." Claire smiled warmly. "Mr. Mayor." Thomas laughed softly. "How many times do I have to ask you to call me Thomas?" A ripple of surprise moved through the restaurant. The two clearly knew each other. Not casually, not professionally, comfortably, naturally, as if this was far from their first conversation. Claire shook his hand. "Old habits." Thomas glanced around the restaurant. "I heard you were working tonight." Claire looked amused. "And somehow you still found time to stop by." "For you," Thomas said. "Always." The exchange lasted only seconds, but it completely transformed the atmosphere. Moments earlier, Claire had been treated as someone easy to dismiss. Suddenly, the mayor himself was greeting her like an old friend. Victoria watched from across the room, confusion replacing confidence. One of her friends leaned closer. "Do they know each other?" Victoria offered no answer, because she did not have one. Nearby customers whispered quietly among themselves. The restaurant manager looked both relieved and curious. Thomas turned back toward Claire. "I have been hoping to catch you for weeks." Claire smiled. "That sounds dangerous." "Not at all." His expression softened. "Actually, I owe you another thank you." The words seemed simple, yet they carried weight. Real weight. Claire immediately shook her head. "You do not owe me anything." "That is where you are wrong," Thomas replied. Around them, people listened without pretending otherwise. Even the staff had stopped moving for a moment. The mayor of the city was thanking a waitress. Not politely, not formally, sincerely. Claire glanced down briefly at the old silver watch on her wrist. The familiar gesture seemed almost automatic. Then she looked back up. "You give me far too much credit." Thomas smiled. "And you never take enough." Across the room, Victoria Hayes felt something unfamiliar. Unease. Because for the first time all evening, she realized she might not know anything about the woman she had spent hours trying to belittle. And before the night was over, she was about to learn just how wrong her assumptions had been. For a few moments, nobody seemed quite sure what to do. The restaurant continued operating, but the rhythm felt different now. Conversations resumed in whispers. Servers returned to work while stealing occasional glances toward Claire and Mayor Thomas Reed. Victoria Hayes sat motionless at her table, trying to understand how an evening she believed she controlled had suddenly become something else entirely. Thomas finally accepted the manager's invitation to sit down, but before heading to his table, he turned back toward Claire. "When your shift slows down, I would like a few minutes of your time." Claire smiled politely. "I think we can arrange that." "Good," Thomas replied. "There is something important I have been meaning to discuss with you." He then moved toward the dining area near the windows. Yet the curiosity he left behind remained. One of Victoria's friends leaned closer. "Who exactly is she?" Victoria forced a small shrug. "How would I know?" The answer sounded less confident than she intended. Across the room, Claire resumed her work exactly as she had before. She cleared plates, delivered coffee, checked on guests. Nothing about her behavior changed. She did not suddenly act important because the mayor knew her. She did not seek attention. If anything, she seemed slightly uncomfortable with it. That detail did not go unnoticed. At 9 o'clock, Thomas was served a simple dinner. The manager personally checked on his table twice. Thomas thanked him warmly both times. Yet every few minutes, his eyes drifted toward Claire. Not with authority, with admiration, respect, the kind earned over time. Eventually, one of the younger employees approached Claire near the service station. "Okay," he whispered. "I have to ask, how do you know the mayor?" Claire laughed softly. "It is not a very exciting story." "I doubt that." Claire organized a stack of menus before answering. A few years ago, several community centers were about to lose funding. Some volunteers and local businesses came together to help. And a lot of people worked very hard. The employee smiled. "That is not really an answer." Claire returned the smile. "It is the truth." Meanwhile, Thomas overheard part of the conversation while passing nearby. He stopped and shook his head. "There she goes again." The employee looked confused. Thomas laughed. "She always tells the story that way." Claire sighed playfully. "Because it is accurate." Thomas looked around the room before lowering his voice slightly. The accurate version leaves out the fact that you organized nearly everything. Several nearby employees froze. Thomas continued. The funding campaign helped keep programs open for thousands of families. Claire immediately waved a dismissive hand. Hundreds of people contributed. Yes, Thomas said. After you convinced them to. The exchange lasted only seconds, but its impact spread through the room. Staff members exchanged stunned looks. Customers who overheard the conversation suddenly viewed Claire differently. Not because she wanted recognition, because she clearly deserved it. At table 12, Victoria felt her stomach tighten. Earlier that evening, she had spoken to Claire as if her life could be measured by a uniform. Now every new detail revealed how little she actually knew. And for the first time since arriving at the restaurant, she found herself wishing she could take back every word she had said. The rest of the evening unfolded beneath a strange mixture of admiration and reflection. The restaurant was still busy, but something fundamental had changed. People no longer noticed Claire Morgan simply as a waitress moving between tables. They noticed the quiet confidence she carried, the patience, the humility, the fact that every compliment seemed to make her slightly uncomfortable rather than proud. Victoria Hayes noticed it too. In fact, she could think of little else. Earlier that night, she had been certain she understood exactly who Claire was. She had reduced an entire human being to a uniform and a job title. Now every new revelation made that assumption feel smaller. Across the dining room, Thomas Reed finished his meal and spent several minutes speaking with local residents who approached his table. He greeted each person warmly. Yet whenever someone mentioned the community programs that had helped neighborhoods throughout the city, Thomas redirected the conversation toward Claire. He never exaggerated. He never turned her into a celebrity. He simply told the truth. That truth proved powerful enough. Around 9:45, a retired school principal approached Claire near the coffee station. "Excuse me," she said gently. "I overheard part of the conversation earlier." Claire smiled politely. "Yes." The woman's eyes softened. "My grandson attends one of those after-school programs." Claire immediately looked down. "That is wonderful." "No," the woman replied quietly. "What is wonderful is that people cared enough to keep it open." For a moment, neither spoke. Then the woman reached out and squeezed Claire's hand. "Thank you." Claire smiled, but this time emotion briefly touched her eyes. "You are very kind." The woman walked away. Nearby, several employees watched the exchange unfold. One of the cooks stepped out from the kitchen carrying supplies and shook his head in disbelief. "I have worked beside you for 3 years," he said. 3 years. And I never knew any of this." Claire laughed softly. "That is because I never thought it mattered. It matters now." Claire considered the statement before responding. The work matters. The people matter. Recognition is optional. The answer lingered with everyone who heard it. Meanwhile, Victoria sat quietly staring at her untouched coffee. Her friends had become unusually subdued. No one seemed interested in making jokes anymore. The confidence that had filled their table earlier had slowly disappeared. In its place was an uncomfortable awareness. Not because Claire had embarrassed anyone. She had done the opposite. She had continued treating them with exactly the same courtesy she offered every guest. Somehow that made the lesson impossible to escape. As Claire walked past the table once more, Victoria looked up. Their eyes met briefly. Claire smiled. The same smile she had worn from the beginning of the evening. No resentment. No victory. No judgment. Just kindness. And for reasons Victoria could not fully explain, that simple act felt heavier than every conversation that had happened since the mayor arrived. Because sometimes the deepest form of justice is not watching someone fall. Sometimes it is watching someone remain gracious when they have every reason not to. By 10 o'clock, the dinner crowd had begun to thin, but the story unfolding inside the Harbor Lantern continued to linger in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. The restaurant lights cast a warm glow across polished tables. Coffee cups replaced dinner plates. Conversations became quieter, more reflective. Yet at table 12, silence had become the loudest voice of all. Victoria Hayes no longer looked like the confident woman who had entered the restaurant earlier. She sat staring into her coffee, replaying the evening in her mind. Every sarcastic remark, every dismissive comment, every moment she had mistaken kindness for weakness. Across the room, Claire Morgan continued working without the slightest sign of triumph. If anything, she seemed relieved that attention had shifted elsewhere. She was helping a young family settle their bill when Thomas Reed approached her once again. This time he carried a simple envelope in his hand. "I almost forgot," he said. Claire immediately looked suspicious. "Thomas." The mayor smiled. "I know that look." "Then you already know I do not want whatever is inside that envelope." Several nearby employees laughed quietly. Thomas shook his head. "Unfortunately for you, this is not optional." Claire sighed with playful resignation. "That does not sound encouraging." Thomas handed her the envelope anyway. "The city council approved it last week." Claire stared at the envelope but made no effort to open it. "Approved what?" Thomas looked around the restaurant before answering. "A formal recognition ceremony next month." Claire closed her eyes briefly. "Absolutely not." Thomas laughed. "That was also my first reaction when they suggested naming the Community Service Award after you." The words spread through the room almost instantly. Several employees froze. A customer near the bar nearly dropped his spoon into a dessert plate. Claire looked genuinely alarmed. "They named what after me?" Thomas smiled. "Too late." The vote was unanimous. The restaurant erupted into spontaneous applause. Not loud enough to disrupt the evening. Just sincere. Warm. Earned. Claire immediately shook her head and looked down, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "This is ridiculous." "No," Thomas replied softly. "What would be ridiculous is pretending your work never mattered." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then one of the cooks started clapping again. Another employee joined. Soon several customers followed. Claire stood motionless, her old silver watch reflecting the restaurant lights. The expression on her face revealed something rare. Not pride. Gratitude. Quiet gratitude. Across the room, Victoria watched everything unfold. The applause. The respect. The admiration. None of it had been demanded. None of it had been purchased. It had been earned through years of service no one had noticed. That realization settled heavily over her, because she suddenly understood something important. Claire had entered the evening with exactly the same worth she possessed now. The only thing that had changed was other people's awareness of it. And perhaps that was the most humbling lesson of all. Some people do extraordinary things without ever needing the world to know. Until one day, the truth simply walks into the room and introduces itself. The applause gradually faded, but the feeling it left behind remained. Employees returned to their duties. Customers resumed their conversations. Yet something had shifted permanently inside the Harbor Lantern. The restaurant no longer felt like a place where people were simply eating dinner. For one evening, it had become a place where assumptions were quietly dismantled. Claire Morgan slipped the unopened envelope into her apron pocket and immediately returned to work. She checked on tables, delivered receipts, and thanked guests for visiting. The gesture seemed almost unbelievable to some of the people watching. Minutes earlier, they had learned she was being honored by the city. Yet she continued serving coffee as though nothing had happened. Thomas Reed noticed the reactions around him and smiled. He had seen this many times before. Recognition never changed Claire. It only made everyone else realize who she had been all along. At table 12, Victoria Hayes finally asked for the check. Her voice lacked the confidence it carried earlier in the evening. One of her friends quietly gathered her purse. Another avoided eye contact altogether. The energy surrounding the table had completely transformed. When Claire approached with the bill presenter, the entire group seemed uncomfortable. Claire, however, behaved exactly as she always had. "I hope you enjoyed your evening," she said warmly. No sarcasm, no hidden meaning, just genuine courtesy. Victoria looked up at her. For a moment, it seemed as though she wanted to say something. Several times she opened her mouth, then stopped. Claire waited patiently. Finally, Victoria spoke. "I think I owe you an apology." The surrounding noise of the restaurant suddenly felt very far away. Claire remained calm. "You do not owe me anything, ma'am." Victoria lowered her eyes. "That is generous of you, but I think I do." Her friends remained silent. There was nothing they could add. Victoria took a slow breath. "I made assumptions about you." Claire said nothing. She simply listened. "And I was wrong." The words sounded difficult to say. Honest, but difficult. Claire glanced briefly toward the windows where city lights reflected against the glass. Then she looked back at Victoria and smiled. "We all get people wrong sometimes." Victoria blinked. The response was not what she expected. "That is it." Claire nodded gently. "That is it." No lecture. No embarrassment. No attempt to make the moment larger than it needed to be. Victoria stared at her for several seconds. Then something softened in her expression. Perhaps for the first time all evening, she was seeing Claire clearly. Not as a waitress, not as a symbol, not as someone to impress or dismiss. Simply as a person. Across the room, Thomas watched the exchange quietly. He understood what was happening better than anyone. The real lesson of the evening was not that Claire had earned the mayor's respect. It was that she had never needed it to possess dignity. Respect from others was only recognition of something that already existed. As Victoria signed the receipt, she looked up one final time. "Thank you," she said softly. Claire smiled. "Have a wonderful evening." The same words she had spoken hours earlier. Yet now they carried an entirely different meaning. And as Victoria prepared to leave, she realized that the most memorable person she had met that night was not the mayor. It was the woman she had nearly failed to see. After Victoria Hayes and her friends left the restaurant, a quiet calm settled over the harbor lantern. The tension that had lingered throughout the evening finally disappeared. Employees seemed lighter. Customers smiled more easily. Even the music felt softer somehow. Yet Claire Morgan behaved exactly as she always did. She collected menus, organized receipts, and helped clear the final tables of the night. Nothing about her posture suggested she had just become the center of attention. Nothing about her expression hinted that she considered the evening extraordinary. To her, work still needed to be finished. Across the dining room, Thomas Reed remained seated near the window. Most of his meal was gone now. A cup of coffee rested beside him. He watched Claire move through the restaurant and shook his head with quiet amusement. The manager approached his table. "She really is something special." Thomas smiled. "That is what I have been trying to tell people for years." The manager glanced toward Claire. "You know, if she ever wanted a different career, she could probably have one by tomorrow morning." Thomas laughed softly. "She has been offered many. And she always asks the same question." "What question?" Thomas looked out the window at the city lights. "Will it help more people than what I am already doing?" The manager stared in surprise. Thomas nodded. "That is how she makes decisions." Near the service station, Claire was helping a new employee close out her first Saturday shift. The young woman looked exhausted. "I do not think I am good at this," she admitted. Claire smiled. "You survived the busiest night of the week." "Barely. That still counts." The young woman laughed. "You make everything sound easier than it is." Claire considered that for a moment. Most things become easier when you stop trying to impress people. The advice lingered. The young employee nodded slowly. Later, as the restaurant prepared to close, Thomas finally stood from his table and walked toward Claire. This time there was no audience gathering around them. No dramatic moment. Just two people talking near the front entrance while employees completed their final tasks. "I should probably let you finish your shift," Thomas said. Claire smiled. "That would be appreciated." Thomas glanced toward the envelope still tucked inside her apron pocket. "You are really going to pretend that recognition ceremony is not happening?" Claire laughed. "I am considering several strategies, such as moving to another state." Thomas shook his head. "That would not work." "I suspected as much." For a moment, they simply stood there smiling. Then Thomas became more serious. "You know why people respect you, Claire?" She immediately answered. "Because they are very generous." "No," he shook his head gently. "Because you never change depending on who is standing in front of you." Claire looked away toward the dining room. Several employees were stacking chairs. Others were sweeping floors. Ordinary work. Ordinary people. "Everyone deserves respect," she said quietly. Thomas nodded. "Exactly." The words hung in the air for a moment. Simple words. Yet somehow they explained everything that had happened that evening. The mayor eventually said good night and stepped out into the city. Claire returned to work. And as the final customers prepared to leave, one truth had become impossible to ignore. The strongest person in the room had never been the loudest. She had simply been the kindest. The restaurant finally closed a little after 11. The last customer had gone home. The front doors were locked. Chairs rested upside down on tables while employees completed their closing routines. The soft piano music that had played throughout the evening was gone now, replaced by the quiet sounds of sweeping, stacking, and preparation for the next day. Claire Morgan stood behind the counter organizing receipts. The old silver watch on her wrist showed 11:17. It had been a long evening. Yet unlike many difficult shifts, she felt surprisingly peaceful. Across the room, several employees were still talking about everything that had happened. Every few minutes, someone mentioned the mayor, the community programs, or the city award. Claire tried her best to redirect the conversations. It never worked. You realize none of us are ever going to look at you the same way again. One server joked while counting tips. Claire smiled. That sounds unfortunate. I am serious. So am I. The staff laughed. Even after everything, she remained exactly the same person. The manager approached carrying a clipboard. Before everyone leaves, I want to say something. The room gradually grew quiet. Employees looked up from their work. The manager glanced around the restaurant before speaking. Tonight reminded me why this place works. He looked toward Claire. Not because of publicity, not because of important guests, because of people who show up every day and treat others well whether anyone notices or not. Several employees nodded. The manager continued. That kind of character cannot be trained. It has to be chosen. Claire immediately looked uncomfortable with the attention. The manager smiled. Do not worry. I am not making a speech. Thank goodness, Claire replied. More laughter followed. Yet after the moment passed, the manager's words remained. Character has to be chosen. Claire understood that better than most. It was not something that appeared during important moments. It was built during ordinary ones. Every patient response, every act of kindness, every opportunity to take the higher road when a lower one seemed easier. As the staff prepared to leave, the newest employee approached Claire one final time. Can I ask you something? Claire nodded. Of course. The young woman hesitated. When that customer was being difficult earlier, were you hurt? Claire considered the question honestly. A little. The answer surprised her. Really? Claire smiled softly. Kind words feel good. Unkind words still sting sometimes. Then how did you stay so calm? For a moment, Claire looked down at her father's watch. Then she answered, because another person's behavior does not get to decide mine. The young employee remained silent. Claire gently picked up her coat. People show you who they are. You decide who you will be. The simple advice settled deeply. A few minutes later, everyone headed home. The restaurant lights dimmed one section at a time. Claire was among the last to leave. As she stepped outside, cool night air greeted her. The city stretched before her in thousands of lights. Somewhere in those buildings were people who knew her story. Thousands more who never would. Neither fact seemed especially important. What mattered was the work. The people. The opportunities to help. She glanced once towards City Hall visible in the distance, then began walking toward home with the same quiet smile she had carried all evening. And though most of the city would never know it, the strongest lesson taught that night had not come from a mayor, an award, or public recognition. It had come from a waitress who refused to let someone else's pride change her kindness. 3 weeks passed quietly after that evening. Life in the city moved forward the way it always did. New stories replaced old headlines. New challenges demanded attention. Yet for some people, the memory of that night remained surprisingly vivid. At the Harbor Lantern, customers still occasionally mentioned it. Employees still smiled whenever someone brought up the mayor's visit. Claire Morgan, meanwhile, continued living exactly as she had before. She worked her shifts, helped with community projects, checked on neighbors, answered emails late at night. Nothing about her routine suggested she had become the namesake of a city award. In fact, she seemed determined to avoid discussing it altogether. On a bright Thursday afternoon, City Hall hosted the recognition ceremony she had unsuccessfully tried to escape. The council chamber was filled with local leaders, volunteers, educators, and families whose lives had been touched by the programs she helped create. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating rows of seats and polished wooden floors. Claire sat quietly near the back, wishing very much that nobody would notice her. Unfortunately, that was impossible. Thomas Reed stood at the front of the room preparing to speak. Before beginning, he glanced toward Claire and smiled. She immediately knew she was in trouble. There are people, Thomas began, who help because they want recognition. And there are people who help despite recognition. Soft laughter moved through the audience. Everyone understood who he meant. Thomas continued. Today we honor someone who spent years solving problems without asking for credit. Someone who showed us that leadership does not require a title. Claire looked down at her hands. The old silver watch rested on her wrist, as it always had. Thomas spoke about community centers, scholarship programs, food drives, volunteer networks, not as achievements, as examples of what ordinary people could accomplish when they cared about one another. Then he invited several residents to share their own stories. One by one they stepped forward. A teacher whose students benefited from after-school programs. A single father who found support during difficult years. A college student who earned a scholarship through one of the initiatives Claire helped organize. Their words filled the room with something more powerful than praise. Gratitude. Genuine gratitude. Claire listened quietly. At one point, she blinked rapidly and looked toward the windows. Not because she wanted attention, because some emotions are difficult to hide when they come from sincere places. Near the end of the ceremony, Thomas presented the award. The audience stood. Applause filled the chamber. Yet the moment that stayed with Claire was not receiving the plaque. It was what happened afterward. As people gathered to leave, dozens of individuals approached her. Not to congratulate her. To thank her. Parents. Students. Volunteers. Neighbors. Their stories were different, but the message remained the same. Something she helped create had mattered. That realization touched her more deeply than any public recognition ever could. Hours later, after the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed, Claire stepped outside into the afternoon sunlight. The city looked exactly the same as it always had. Cars moved through intersections. People hurried along sidewalks. Life continued. She glanced at the plaque tucked beneath her arm and smiled softly. Then she thought about the restaurant, about Victoria Hayes, about the difficult evening that had unexpectedly led here. Sometimes life had a strange way of revealing truths. Not through arguments, not through revenge, simply by allowing character to stand quietly in the light. 6 months later, a familiar Saturday evening settled over the city. The streets glowed beneath golden sunset light. Restaurants filled with families, couples, and friends gathering at the end of a busy week. Inside the harbor lantern, the atmosphere remained warm and welcoming, much as it had on the night that quietly changed so many lives. Claire Morgan was working once again. She moved through the dining room with the same calm smile, the same steady patience, and the same old silver watch resting against her wrist. Some things never changed, and perhaps that was the point. Recognition had come. Awards had come. Public appreciation had come. Yet none of those things had altered the person she chose to be. Near the front entrance, a familiar face stepped inside. Victoria Hayes paused for a moment before approaching the hostess. She looked different somehow, not because of her clothes or appearance, because of her expression. There was less urgency there, less need to be noticed. The hostess seated her at a quiet table near the window. When Claire eventually approached with a menu, both women smiled. This time there was no tension, no discomfort, only mutual understanding. "Good evening," Claire said warmly. Victoria returned the smile. "Good evening, Claire." The simple exchange carried more meaning than anyone around them could have understood. As the evening continued, Victoria treated every employee with genuine kindness. She thanked the staff. She listened more than she spoke. Before leaving, she quietly handed the manager a donation for one of the community programs she had learned about months earlier. She requested no publicity, no announcement, no recognition. Claire noticed but said nothing. Sometimes growth does not need witnesses. Later that evening, Thomas Reed stopped by for dinner. He greeted employees, shook hands with customers, and shared a brief conversation with Claire near the coffee station. Everything felt comfortable, familiar, peaceful. Looking around the restaurant, Thomas smiled. "You know," he said quietly, "that night may have taught more people than any speech I have ever given." Claire laughed softly. "That seems unlikely." "Not really." Thomas looked toward the guests enjoying their meals. People remember kindness, especially when they expect anger. For a moment, neither spoke. The restaurant buzzed gently around them. Glasses clinked. Conversations drifted through the air. Somewhere near the windows, a child laughed. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. The kind Claire had always valued most. Before leaving, Thomas glanced toward her old watch. "Your father would be proud." Claire looked down at it and smiled. A quiet smile. A grateful one. "I hope so." As the evening came to an end, Claire stepped outside for a moment and looked across the city skyline. Lights stretched toward the horizon. Thousands of stories unfolding at once. Some loud, some quiet. She thought about how easily people judge one another. How often worth is mistaken for status. How many remarkable people pass through life unnoticed because they do not demand attention. Then she smiled and headed back inside. Because there was still work to do, still people to help, still kindness to give. And perhaps that was the true ending of the story. Not that someone important recognized her value, but that her value had never depended on recognition in the first place. Character remains long after titles fade. Dignity remains long after applause ends. And sometimes the strongest person in the room is simply the one who chooses kindness when nobody would blame them for choosing otherwise. If this story touched something in your heart, perhaps it is because you have met someone like Claire, or maybe because you hope to become someone like her. Share your thoughts below, and if stories about quiet strength, dignity, and unexpected grace stay with you, we would be honored to see you again on the next journey.